I just want to welcome everyone and pardon my absence last week. I had a conflict. I was giving a retreat with Circle of Friends, which is a group within the Contemplative Outreach organization, a very lovely group of people. So the time, believe it or not, conflicted with this one. So I wasn't able to be here. So once again, thank you, Brother Columba, for sort of leading that. I was able to see the recording afterward, and it looked like a lot of fun. And thanks for sharing a bit about monastic life. So appreciate it. All right, so let me call up this morning our screen. So as always, Benum Christ in it, I greet Christ in you, and I welcome you all back here today. And we begin with our opening prayer. So out of the depths, Lord, I call you. Let me feel you even in this darkness. Take away my affliction, or give me the strength to endure. Out of the depths, Lord, I call you. Let me feel you even in this darkness. Take my affliction and give me the strength to endure. If all our mistakes were indelible, which of us could survive? But you have forgiven us, even when we cannot forgive ourselves. I listen for you. My soul listens like a deer in the forest. My soul waits more intently than a soldier watching for the dawn. Answer me. Open my heart so that I can wholly receive you, and teach me that when I am ready, you will let this suffering pass. And this is an adapted psalm from Stephen Mitchell in his book called The Book of Psalms. So for those of you who have the book and would like to follow both our paragraphs today come from page 42 in the second chapter. We were talking 2 weeks ago about the sort of 70s and 80s movement within Christianity to really reevaluate what had, I think, for many in that particular generation become a sort of shame-based and guilt-based sort of sin-soaked Christianity, and really try to move away from that kind of emphasis and language. And that's what's leading into to the paragraphs that we read today. This was the same generation that spawned the self-help movement and invented the inner child as a metaphor for self-care. But all children, even inner children, must eventually grow up. And when we do, each of us must learn to admit, with candor and humility, that the expulsion from Eden is not a story about our primeval parents eons ago, but reflects rather the state of our own interior lives. Like all myths, the story of Adam and Eve never happened historically, but it is always happening in the heart of every person. In honor of the Transfiguration, I have that for us today. Our second reading today. So Eden is the myth of our coming of age. How easily we are seduced into forsaking intimacy with God in exchange for an illusory autonomy that, as we will see, is the source of all our misery. Such an honest personal inventory leaves no high moral ground on which I might stand to judge another, no high horse on which to parade my moral superiority. Rather, awakening to the reality of our self-imposed exile unexpectedly brings with it glad tidings of the extravagant grace of God, who even now rushes out to embrace us. It is only before such a God that we are free to look at ourselves with unrelenting honesty. So for those who might need to leave us this morning before our conversation, we have a closing prayer. So may God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, superficial relationships, so that you will live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you will work for justice, equality, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you will reach out your hand to comfort them and change their pain into joy. And may God bless you with the foolishness to think that you can make a difference in the world, so that you will do the things which others tell you cannot be done. Amen. There was a request from Joanne for the psalm, which comes from Stephen Mitchell's book on page 71, Psalm 130. That was the original prayer. I had some dictation typos in there, which I've corrected, but that's the psalm there, Joanne. Okay. So, one of the things that I'm trying to do over the next several pages is explore this myth of Eden on various levels, and we're here in the sort of realm of psychology. I'll be moving it to a deeper exploration of mythology as we explore in the next subsection sort of the distinction between ego and false self, and how the myth of Eden, I think, helps to delineate those two entities, if you want to call them that. And then move into a scientific or evolutionary worldview question. How does the myth of Eden, particularly as a creation myth, expand or come into relief in light of what we now know to be an evolutionary universe? So I'm trying to explore this myth from the interior or psychological, looking then also at evolutionary or scientific worldview, and to show that ultimately these all, in a sense, integrate and inform one another. And then we'll be moving on from there to a discussion of the unity of all things that I think is another implication of the myth. So that's what lies ahead over the next several weeks. But we're clearly this morning in that realm of psychology, and looking at sort of the sociological impacts of that move in the 60s and in the 1960s in many Western cultures away from the sort of institutional structures that kind of governed our sense of identity, oftentimes within Christianity, around issues of guilt and sin, and perhaps an overemphasis on all of those things. And we're in that spiritual revolution that really unfolded over the last 50 years of re-examining that inheritance, And that's what these particular paragraphs are trying to look at. So I open the floor first with any questions you might have, or reflections or thoughts or reactions to that. And you are, by the way, spanning a couple of pages. So if possible, to use the little electronic hand, that'll make sure I see you. Yes, Richard, please.
We're so blessed to be together. Thank you. The dictation typo was extraordinary. May we have the strength to endure.
I know. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's great. It's great. That's exactly what we need. Strength to endure the sheltering and grace to.
That's maybe a graced moment, but I can't take any credit for it. Only the blame.
Okay. And the idea that that God is rushing out to welcome this prodigal son home from my self-exile. A second returning, as you once spoke, to the garden. It leaves time, it leaves chronos time and brings us into always already time. We're already home. We're already embraced in love, and our mind that grasps for other takes us away. And we are here eternally in God's love in the Garden of Eden. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. Yeah, one of the, I think one of the overarching trajectories of spiritual maturity, or moving into spiritual maturity, at least as I kind of experience it in the other direction, is a move toward integration and an integral self. And there's many who've spoken about this idea of what I notice in myself in terms of my own spiritual immaturity is how fragmented I can feel sometimes, how disintegrated I feel. And I think that the overarching movement of spiritual maturity is that gradual move toward interior integration, which is, I think, as you're saying, Richard, symbolized by Eden, this real, not only because to be integrated with oneself, body, mind, spirit, right, psychology, emotions, to be integrated is to move into that place of tranquility that the Eastern Fathers call Hezekiah or hesychasm, that deep inner sense of tranquility with God, or what we're calling symbolically Eden, that sense of deep intimate relationship with God. And what I notice in myself, in my own work yet to be done, is those things I say, where did that come from? How is that me? How did that reaction rise up in me? Like, where is that? And I start to realize these are disintegrated elements of myself, parts that haven't been reconciled. And I think woundedness, emotional, spiritual, psychological, has the deleterious effect of disintegrating us, right? And sometimes that happens because we need to protect ourselves, right? We have to, in a sense, quarantine our emotions from being in an abusive relationship, right? We have to kind of cocoon those things to protect ourselves. And for a long time, we find survival tools to get through difficult times in life, trauma, sustained abuse on one level or another. And then once we are out of those situations, those circumstances, we can, in a safe space, if you want to say, begin the work of reintegrating. And when we don't, we end up with a very fractured interior life that has no means of coming back together. And we're using outdated tools, which are really make sense perhaps in a survival context, but are not ideal for an integral life. And I think that's what I'm a little bit addressing on a sociological level here, that I think on some level, the decades, even centuries of Christian emphasis on personal guilt and shame has, on some sense, and I don't want to overstate it because I think it's much more varied than this, but in some sense has left many people with a degree of a fractured self, because you start thinking, can I be that bad? Am I really that sinful? And is every little thought I've had that isn't pure and perfect really going to land me in hell for an eternity? And do I have to go to confession every Saturday? I can't even think of anything I did wrong in the last 7 days that warrants this whole sort of ritual. And I think then what you see in the self-help movement that I address is a kind of attempt to reintegrate, right? But notice what happened is, in the self-help movement, we invented a separate self, the inner child. So there's an inner fragmentation that we do, where we start to recognize, wait, there's some part of me that's vulnerable and wounded and even immature. Maybe there's a certain arrest of development because of this sort of theological, religious, institutional trauma that many Christians feel over the last centuries we've sort of been forced into. But now I think that we've been able to create this inner child, and I think for a time it serves a purpose, both historically, but also for the life of an individual. But I think the ultimate goal is to reintegrate that aspect of self, and not to keep thinking of this separate aspect of oneself out there. Necessary at first to be able to examine trauma and woundedness, but at some point the whole trajectory of the spiritual life means that inner child needs to grow up, meaning it needs to reintegrate with the whole self. And that's what I'm attempting to address. It's a difficult process depending on how much trauma one has endured. And for some, it is the work of a lifetime. And for others, it's sort of, yes, the work of a lifetime, but not the dominant theme. So I see some hands up. So let me allow some thoughts here to enter. Kathy Todd, I think you were next.
Yeah, just kind of following up on that. In your first paragraph at the end, you talked about the myth of the story of Adam and Eve, and it's coming out of the garden, so that sort of disconnection with God. And I'm wondering if this this autonomy that we develop by doing that is actually part of our human nature, that we're sort of, I'm thinking of the writings of Thomas Keating, where he talks about, as children, we have the strong needs for affection, security, and power, and that it's only through engagement in practice like contemplation which leads us into where each of those elements actually reside for our well-being and the well-being of all creation.
Yeah. So, Kathy, my question is is that a comment, or are you asking me to relate this to Thomas's three?
Well, I'm asking if the myth of Adam and Eve, and that we end up as humans in this illusory autonomy, is that also, in addition to trauma and woundedness, is this a state of, a part and parcel of our human beingness?
So yes, my sense is that, so Catherine Mowry Lacuna has a very big but beautiful book on the Trinity, and she in that really explores the distinction between what she calls theonomy and autonomy. And so theonomy literally means, it literally means, in a sense, a way of life unto God, or a sense of being God, grounded or rooted in the divine, which we can think of as Eden, Adam and Eve, grounded, rooted in this relationship with the divine. And this sort of the so-called original sin, or the fall, is when humanity strives to become autonomous, that is to say, to grasp for something that in fact they already possess in relationship. So if you eat of this fruit, you know that you will be like God, right? You know that you will know the difference between good and evil, just like God. And you understand that God doesn't want you to know that. This is sort of the truth and lie mix of the serpent, right? Because in a sense, it is precisely the intimacy of that divine human union of Eden, theonomy, that gets torn asunder by humanity's attempt to go after the very thing they already possess, to be like God, right? But they try to possess it outside of that divine human relationship. They try to bypass the intimacy. And of course, this becomes the model for all of humanity's problems. When we strive outside of intimate relationship for whatever, to fulfill those things, like for affection and security and power, when in fact they are found precisely in right relationship, not in conflictual or outside of relationship. So in a sense, this becomes a metaphor for striving for something we already possess, for striving to achieve something that is already God-given, striving to become independent, an island unto ourselves, when in fact there is no such thing. Instead of recognizing our interdependence, the whole history of covenanting theology, where God actually enters into covenant with humanity, there is a more than subtle suggestion there that what is at the heart of divine human relationship, not just from our side, but from the side of God, is the vulnerability of intimate relationship. That's what covenant is about. I agree to do this and you agree to do that. And what this does uniquely in the ancient world is puts Israel's God at risk of being rejected. The Olympian gods there was no risk of rejecting an Olympian god. They didn't engage humanity enough. We were just playthings to them. So this consciousness within Judaism, within ancient Israel, that God would literally put the divine self at risk, particularly of rejection, is there we enter the humility of the Jewish Christian God, right? Who's willing and able to actually do this for the sake of that love to be explored. So in many ways, this is not only the way in which the history of divine human relationships is told throughout the story of Israel and of the church, but is also the way in which I think that story is told that way because it's the way in which we all come to our own maturity. We first, Jennifer and I were having a recent conversation about sort of the psychology of this, that in many ways it just mirrors what growing up looks like. We all know teenagers are rebellious and they want to push back, and the innocence of being 1 and 2 years old, where mom and dad were their world, begins to fade as they strike out in this sort of independence. So in many ways, it just reflects what human psychological development looks like. We go from the inability to distinguish ourselves from anyone or anything else to that subject-object relations, right? I'm not you, you're not me. And then the spiritual life becomes the process of maturing into a greater, deeper exploration of our union. And this gets reflected in the very way in which Israel and God relate to one another, right? So in Eden, there's no subject-object relations in a sense. It's that unity between God and humanity, and then we rebel and we try to strike out on our own, and God keeps coming back and saying, but there's something more, there's something deeper, there's something more intimate. And eventually we come within the Christian context of being enfolded back in the incarnation into that divine love, where we have a kind of interdependent relationship, a co-creative, or the real fruition of a covenanted relationship. So these myths play on all these levels simultaneously, I think.
Okay. Could you say the name of the book and the author again?
Did I mention a book? I'm sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, it's by Catherine somebody.
Oh yeah, it's called God for Us. Catherine Mowry Lacuna, L-A-C, maybe it's C-U-N-A, Lacuna. I'm spelling her last name wrong. But if you look up the book God for Us, it's a very thick book. It's a lot of investment in the Trinity, but she writes it quite beautifully, actually, if you're interested in an exploration of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, good morning. Wonderful to see you again. I wanted to ask about the myth of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and what you were just describing beautifully as our fractured selves that are rooted in trauma. And I wanted to hear what you would say about the collective trauma field that we're born into, the transgenerational trauma, how that relates, cultural trauma, societal trauma, because as we're emerging into a much more profound, intimate understanding and relationship of the trauma field that we were all born into, meaning a America that was built on genocide and slavery, just for starters, or in Europe, the Holocaust and the ever rippling effects of societal trauma. I wonder how you could relate what you've just been describing in terms of our individual and personal development and our reintegration of those locked away, overwhelming experiences that our intelligence actually helped us to shut off until we developed enough to be able to experience the pain. How can we take the teachings of Christ, of the Bible, of this myth of Adam and Eve, of our interior development, and expand them into the necessary societal and cultural and collective development that we must achieve to address this unspoken trauma field that we all have been born into, either knowingly or unknowingly? Just a little question for you.
Yeah, just a small little. No, I think, you raised a really excellent question. So just a few comments, perhaps, rather than an answer, but so the way in which the Eastern Orthodox Church, by and large, understands original sin, which is a sense what's being, sort of, which is in the background of everything I'm writing about right now, is very different from the West. And I think that the Eastern Orthodox model helps to respond to your question. So let me just spell it out very quickly. So in the West, it was St. Augustine in the 4th century who really developed what became the long-standing model for how we are to understand original sin, which he thought of as a stain on the soul. And so in the West, original sin is like a spot that the waters of baptism have to wash away. And as has been pointed out, the way he understood the transmission of original sin is through what he called concupiscence, which would be the inherent lust attached to every sexual act that, say, even a married couple would have. So he says it's impossible to engage in sexual intercourse without the introduction of this sort of lust, right? And so so in a sense, or for Augustine, he wouldn't use this term, but I've seen it used recently, that for Augustine, original sin is a sexually transmitted disease, right? Where the married couple sort of through this act of lust transmits this spot or the stain on the soul of the child, which is why in the Roman Catholic Church, the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, not the virginal conception of Jesus, but the Immaculate Conception of Mary, says that when her parents conceived her, it was she was preserved from that stain of sin. And why? To make her pure so she could be the vessel through whom the divine would come into the world. Now, say what you want about that doctrine. In the Eastern Church, they would look at Immaculate Conception and say, well, in our understanding of original sin, that just doesn't even make sense because we don't see it as a spot in the first place. And we certainly don't see it as a spot that's transmitted through sexual intercourse. So what for the East is original sin? For them, it's not a something, it's not a spot, it's not a positive thing that needs to be washed away. It's an absence, it's a lack of something that should be there. It's a deficiency. And that deficiency, what do the waters of baptism do? Make up for it. So imagine you're supposed to be born with a full glass of water, but you only got half glass of water, and the waters of baptism fill you to the brim with the grace, right, of God. So So for them, talking about the Immaculate Conception just doesn't make sense because they're starting with a very different premise. But here in that Eastern conception, I think in modern contexts, what the Orthodox have as a way of responding, Sylvia, to your type of question is to say, we are born into a world that is already broken. And because of that trauma, that brokenness, we tend to adopt and absorb and be formed by that brokenness, which in turn traumatizes and breaks us. And thereby, we become participants in the brokenness, contributors to the brokenness, right? And so forth, right? Because the whole system is in a sense broken. We see this come out, I think, in modern phraseology in historical trauma, personal trauma, right? Abusive relationships. I mean, we see, for example, in scriptures, this occasional coming back to the sins of the father, as it were, and mother for that matter, are paid for by the children. And we think, oh, that's cruel, that's terrible. But isn't it true that the world that our forebearers create, we're suffering for that, right? So there is a sense, look, in a world in which God was conceived of as in full control of every last thing that ever happens, one can say, you see, God is punishing the children for the sins of the parents. Well, we don't think of God being a micromanager so much anymore. But the truth of what's trying to get expressed there, I think, is very powerful, that every generation passes on and creates the world into which the next generation, if we don't fix it, gets re-traumatized or dragged into that history, right? So when we think of original sin as that deficiency that by which we're blinded by greed and therefore lead to environmental destruction, where we're prone to violence, which escalates in nuclear warfare, when we're prone toward all the things that, right, we are inheritors of that and we suffer because of that. So when we do that blindly, when we don't do the inner work of realizing I've inherited a broken world, and because of me needing to survive in that world, have become fragmented and broken, until I do that inner work, I just keep perpetuating and carrying on. So when you look at that very dynamic collectively, our society is now being challenged in a very poignant, very powerful moment to collectively look at what people are rightly calling our national original sins of genocide and racism and slavery and so forth. Now, that doesn't make any one of us born in the last 70 years, 75, 80 years, whatever, personally guilty of that past. And therefore needing to bear the weight of that guilt. But we do have the task of needing to interrogate it, to integrate it, to acknowledge it, and therefore not to continue to allow the sins of this generation to come to bear on our children and our children's children. And Sylvia, I remember, for example, that beautiful poem you read about, our our-great-grandchildren telling, right, that poem coming back and saying, why didn't you do anything with regard to, say, climate change? That's exactly the point. Our task is not only to look backward and to see how have entire subsets of people, African Americans, Native Americans, how have they been culturally and sociologically and spiritually traumatized by this history, and how do we integrate the various races? Again, that requires inner work on all of our parts, just as we would if it was our own individual life trying to reintegrate personal trauma. In many ways, I think it works the same way. And it's interesting to note that, there's this recent, now burgeoning group in the United States called Our Better Angels. I think somebody told me recently they're called now Our Braver Angels, which is trying to get people on opposite sides of the political spectrum to do that integral work and come back together and stop perpetuating the cultural, religious, political divide that we've all fallen into in such drastic degrees. All right. Yeah. So, and how interesting that in order to try to heal the country, they're using family therapy practices.
Right. I've been to several of their meetings and I get all of their emails, usually one a day.
Yeah.
So yes, Braver Angels.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how might we apply that sort of technology, I'm sorry, wrong word, psychology to race relations in this country,
I
for
think,
example?
as you said, it comes first to, you're in an airplane and it's going down, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, then you can help people. So as you've been teaching, we've been working, and Brother Columba brought up so beautifully last Saturday, to do our work of restoring those fractured parts of ourselves into grace, the grace of being present to the divine. And from that point of our own reintegration and wholeness, we don't have to wait for that to be complete, obviously, but from that inner work, then how we can best serve the world will become clear.
Right.
More, yeah.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. We have to do, it's almost become a psychological truism. If you don't deal with your own demons, you're going to project them onto the world. We all know, and we've all seen this happening in our own lives. So in a sense, and when you look at the model of what Jesus was doing, or even what Paul was doing, there's a lot of passages in the Pauline epistles that speak to this integral work, especially between Jews and the new converts from the Gentile world into Christianity. Groups that had been, frankly, in our own, we would call today, had been profoundly racist in their approach to one another, and now he's saying, look, you've got this long history of rejection, and you can't touch one another, you can't talk to one another, you can't sit at the same table, you can only have business associations, right? How do you come together and form an intimate spiritual community with people who for generations had this enmity or dismissiveness really of one another? So it's no different, that same integral work, and everything he does in trying, when we look at that beautiful story in John 8, where the woman is about, to be stoned for adultery. I always wonder where the guy was. I mean, did he get stoned? I don't know what the deal is with that. But anyway, there she is. And what does Jesus do? He walks into that circle, right? That circle of judgment. And what he says is really a call to arms, isn't it? I mean, he says to them, let the person with no sin throw the first stone. That's a call to arms in the interior life. You better start doing the work of grappling with your demons, of fighting your demons, before you start throwing stones at someone else. And of course, shockingly, he gets them at least enough to think it through, to do that inner work. And what do? They all drop their stones and they walk home, leaving her, to start a new life again. That's the work. That's integral work. You have to start integrating your own interior sense of who you are and your own shortcomings, so that, as I say in my the second paragraph, you realize you don't have some high moral horse to ride in on. And that is the great human leveler, right? Where we're all humbled to realize, oh, yeah, I lost my moral horse decades ago. So, so that horse is out of the barn and I've got to walk down in the muck with everybody else, So this is kind of, what we're doing today is our own version. What our country in the United States anyway is being asked to do today is just another version of what Jesus and what Paul were working on in the forging of disciples and new community. Just our version of the same work. So thank you, Sylvia. Yeah. So I realize we're at just at 8 o'clock. I have an extended practice for us today. Robert, is that already available?
Yes, it was sent out, posted on Facebook, and Joanne sent it out.
Oh, perfect. So I'll just call it up for anybody who may be new and hasn't received any of that. But I did ask Robert to post early because it's a bit of a long description. So here's the practice. I want you to think through this. So this is what I'm requesting. Over the course of the week, I'm inviting you to sit quietly on a daily basis and simply let any feelings you have arise within you, feelings particularly that you might describe as fear, anxiety, or hurt. I'm going to ask you to observe that. I'm going to ask you to think about where it lives in you. In what part of the body does this feeling, anxiety, fear, etc., manifest itself? Does it come to you in waves? Is it kind of an underlying persistent presence all day? Do you find yourself being drained by it? Does it distract you from the present moment? Does it have a voice or a particular sound? And what is it saying? So can you picture what it looks like? Its color, its texture, its shape. Is the feeling associated with a particular memory, or is it attached to some future event you fear? I want you to really just spend time getting intimate with whatever that is in you that you think of as uncomfortable. And when you've come to know this feeling more intimately, then I want you to imagine yourself holding it, much as you would a vulnerable child. You can see where I'm getting this from the reading today. And I want you to assure that feeling that you are aware of it. You will attend to it, and to thank it for what it's communicating to you, because it is communicating something real, something authentic, something that needs to be addressed. And then begin to inquire what vulnerable aspect of yourself you're relating to, and to realize that this is self-care, that this is what it means to care for yourself, to put on the mask first, right? As it were. It's a long description, but you get the idea, and you can find it posted as Robert was so kind to put that up. Mary, I see your hand is up. Did you have a question about that?
Oh, no, I didn't have a question.
Oh, was your hand up accidentally, or was there a comment you liked?
No, I noticed that you put up the picture of the Transfiguration.
Yeah.
Was that part of our talk today, or is that just, were you going to talk about that?
No. The reason is because it was an icon that I had found that celebrates the Transfiguration, and we celebrated that. So I just put it up there for those who are aware of that sort of recent liturgical celebration. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Rose, you had a question.
Yes, I'm relatively new to your group, so I don't know, how do you get to the postings? Like, how do I get to what was just posted?
Great.
I couldn't quite copy it. It was too long.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Robert, did you want to put that link up there in the chat box? And Rose, you're able to see the chat box there where you'll
Yes.
be? Okay.
Okay, so if there's a link, I just go to that and it has what you just posted?
Yes, I believe that's where he's going to send us.
And how long does the chat box stay there?
Oh, the one that you're looking at right now?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that will go away when we close down. But when it appears there, if you click on it right now, that you won't disconnect yourself. It'll just take you there, and then you could save that space. So I'll kind of show you. I can actually guide us through that once that gets posted.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to leave my email, which somebody just suggested. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, there you go. So you see, there's the little thing. I just clicked on that now, and I'm going to take you all to that real quickly. I'll just share that with you. So that if you click on that link, Rose, you'll see that it will get you here. And then you could just, Robert, am I correct? You could just do the join group.
That's correct.
Okay. So even if you just, Rose, if you just want to put your cursor on that instead of trying to write that down, and if you just click on that,
Okay.
that will open up. You'll probably see for a moment that your search engine will dominate your screen. You can just leave it, then click back here and leave that in the background, and then you'll have it forever.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And welcome to the group. I'm glad you're here. All right. Okay, Richard.
Yes, Father, you mentioned the Eastern Church and their concept of sin. I heard from Houston Smith and others that the Eastern Church also believes in the perfectibility of us. Does that relate to other Christs?
Yes, it does. That's what I would say would be the fullness of deification.
Thank you.
By the way, I always found it interesting that in the Roman Church, where you have at least a so-called celibate priesthood, how how interesting it is that sin becomes associated with sex, and in the Eastern Church, where priests are allowed to marry, it doesn't. So it's always interesting to notice who's doing the theology and what perspective they come from. All right. Okay, I think we accidentally got Rosemary's screen. Robert, are you able to make that go away? Oh, I think we can do that. Yeah, there we go. Okay. All right, so this is the time where we normally then move to a discussion of practice for those of you who are able to stay behind. And if you can't stay behind with us, we always spend 30 minutes or so looking at the practice I gave the previous week. If you can't stay behind, Benham Christ in it, I wish you a very blessed week ahead and look forward to seeing you next week. Let me just call up the screen then again for those of us who would like to look at what those were from the previous weeks. So if I recall, we didn't quite get around to the discussion of either of these. So let me just open up. These are the two previous practices. One was very simple: be present to grace and be amazed. This is when we were discussing amazing grace. The other one was trusting you rest in the hands of a loving God, reflect deeply, humbly, truthfully on your own perceived shortcomings, and in 2 or 3 lines, write a prayer of confession that expresses whatever arises in the silence. And then in 2 or 3 lines, write out God's response to you. So I'm going to pull those down so we can see one another, but I wanted you just to be aware that I just opened the floor and you're welcome to respond to either one of those. And you have the floor. Yes, Dwight, please. Good to see you.
Father Vincent, for the first of the 2 practices, I had quite an interesting cathartic experience, in a sense that it brought to me a memory of an event I faced last year, in which brought some quite significant consequences for me and also for my family. I won't go into the details because they're not relevant in here. What I'm trying to say is that I toiled with that situation for quite some time, and looking at the practice, the only thing that came to me and really worked was the prayer of the Jesus prayer. Mm-hmm. And I could really experience each and every single word on that prayer, which was to me a great relief. But particularly, I felt the emphasis associated with that passage of the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, on verses 13 and 14, when the tax collector goes home totally forgiven. So on that occasion, looking at this practice 3 weeks ago, I as a reply I received from God was that I am the infinite love, therefore your shortcomings, which you call sins, will be always forgiven. Stand up and walk knowing that I will always be with you, no matter your shortcomings. Two lessons I learned from this, the first of the two practices. One was that the power of confession is significant when it's deeply sincere. And the second lesson from that practice was that the experience of comfort that follows forgiveness is also immense. Now, in terms of grace, which was the following practice, the following week, I continue experiencing this freedom from guilt. But this freedom from guilt, although not denying what was involved in the situation, quite the opposite, helped me to take responsibility over it. But I'm taking control of the situation, not being controlled by it. So carrying that burden on my shoulders completely disappeared. And for me, that experience of being free from that guilt was, to me, the experience of grace I underwent on that situation, on that time. And just to conclude on this, a project that I have outstanding for 2 years, related to some work here in my property, I was able to do in 1 week. So was quite significant, that feeling of relief. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Dwight. That's beautiful. And you know, many people who look to the Jesus prayer do root it back to that text from Luke in 18 that you indeed pointed out. I'm not sure if you're aware of the notion of penthos, Penthos, but you might enjoy reading a little. Probably if you Google it, you'll find a Wikipedia article about it. But penthos, I think, translates a lot as compunction. And the Desert Mothers and Fathers spoke of penthos as the gift of tears, which is precisely that experience of, on the one hand, being acutely aware of one's limitations, or sort of inability to perfect oneself, and the pain that comes with that because of sin or shortcoming. And you know, a lot of the times the mystics say the most painful part of the spiritual life is the moment you recognize that you will never be able to love as much as you know you are loved. And this becomes a searing source of pain for mystics, because the desire is to love God, but as a finite being, you just cannot love the way an infinite being can love you in return. And this, in our modern world, we have grown so impatient with complexity. We want black and white, you know, little soundbite answers, but the spiritual life is all about the capacity to hold complexity. You know, even as we were talking earlier, the complexity of my various disparate parts being sort of finding a way to reintegrate. And the experience that you're describing really sounds a lot like penthos, or what they would call the gift of tears, because the individual monk or nun or mystic or contemplative would come to a moment where they just were crying like uncontrollably, because on the one hand of this deep searing pain of their limitation, and at the same moment the neverthelessness of that, of God's love completely, infinitely, abundantly being poured out. And that contrast becomes the experience of penthos, or grace, the real acknowledgement, like, I have been forgiven, or rather I am constantly living in a state of forgiveness, and that is God's posture toward me, becomes profoundly motivating. Because the idea is now I'm not trying to escape some punishment, but I'm trying to respond with my whole self in gratitude toward this overwhelming love that no matter what I do, I can never quite bear up to. I can never match. How could we? the infinite and the finite, right? There's just no way. But it's that interior recognition that they call penthos. And you may really enjoy looking at that because I think it will speak to this experience that you've had. And I think you'll recognize yourself in it to some degree. It's a beautiful concept.
Thank you. Yeah, I knew by the term compunction that you described. I haven't heard the Greek term for it, but what you described is exactly the experience I underwent, and it was overwhelming.
Yes.
So thanks for that.
Of course. No, it's absolutely beautiful. I sensed as you were telling it that this is penthos. That's exactly what the monks were talking about. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, you might want to look that up if I can find something on it too, because I know there's a book that talks about it at some length that's actually on a contemplative spirituality, but he has a beautiful chapter on penthos that's stunning. So I'll try to pull that up for you if you'd like. But okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, and that brings us to Chad.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for being here with me today.
Of course.
I just wanted to share with you the conversation regarding what I call some shortcomings that I think block me from the sunlight of the Spirit. And it's timely because in my my personal recovery, one of the things we're asked to do is to really be really thorough and honest about what they call a personal inventory. So this assignment came right about the time that I was asked to sit with a very trusted friend and for 6 hours share with him. Which is part of the process is kind of bringing things to the table, getting them out in the open, admitting to God, to ourselves, and another human being our shortcomings. So after this long process and noticing patterns and connections and some really interesting paradox in my life. For example, this is an example how you spoke of the personal trauma from the past, how I fear rejection and judgment of others, yet I am almost pretty quick to reject and judge others. And where's that, why is that? See, those are very interesting, and I still work with those. So, Father, you asked in like 3 lines, and honestly, haiku has never been my thing. The 3-5 thing, I just don't know what the word brevity means. So I'm going to share with you a little writing that I put together with some very long sentences. How's that? All right. But I talk to God often in letters, and I wrote this. Dear Father, I come to you today, your humble child, to ask of you your help. I bring to you my burdens of fear, anger, resentment, dishonesty, and self-centered thought, all of which keep me lonely, joyless, and tired. Please know that my willingness to surrender, to listen for your guiding voice, and change is a long time coming, yet deeply sincere. I am yours always to guide in your higher purpose and loving service. And then you ask to contemplate God's response. And this is what I think he'd say. My dear one, these things I already know, for I love you and dwell within you always. Know that the love, the kindness, the beauty, the joy, and the compassion that I instilled in you are indestructible and strong in you. Know that at any moment of every day, you need only lay these burdens at my feet, fall into my loving arms, and rest in my infinite mercy. For you always have been and forever will be mine. That's it, Father.
Thank you. Beautiful. I'm glad you were able to tap into that divine voice speaking to you in that way. I think, Richard Rohr makes a point that we tend to associate negative, judgmental voices in us as the voice coming from God and not the tender, loving, compassionate voice. And he says the opposite is true, which is partly what motivated me to introduce this exercise to get you in touch. And I think you've done that beautifully. Thank you.
Well, then we can contribute a lot of this, and not to put you on a pedestal, but it has been the topic of conversation in our reading, in that the guilt and the shame-based Catholicism that we move through, you've helped tremendously to, well, I just call it a major course correction. So thank you for that.
Sure, Chad. Thank you. And in fairness, many people within the tradition are doing the same work. We're kind of collaborating to really, we're at a point of really examining that and trying to, again, move to that point of deeper integration. So thank you. And it is certainly not unique to me, to be sure. Okay, Mary, I think your hand was next.
So my story is a story of grace that happened. I've been taking the course, Me and White Supremacy, and been feeling a lot of anxiety, almost to the point where I can't speak. So I identified that as feeling unsafe because there were no Black people around me in the course. And that was really interesting. So I reached out to a Black friend of mine, a deacon, who is part of an African-American church that I was a member of for 5 years. And when I left, there was a lot of hard feelings, and there was a lot of unresolved issues on race that we've never talked about. So I reached out to her and made a date to see her, and met with her. And we had this really wonderful conversation about race in the church. And the conversation went so well. And we met in back of a convent. And as we were talking, 2 women came out and they actually joined our conversation. They were white. And so together we made a plan to do some work in the neighborhood when we could get together around racial issues. So for me, that was a time of grace, because the conversation could have gone anywhere. We could have ended up never seeing each other again. But it was really from the grace of God that we came together the way we did. So I wanted to share that.
Mary, what's so beautiful about that is I think that a lot of us are feeling anxiety around what to do and how to be responsive and how to be a good ally and what to do with our own defensiveness, or all of those things that are sort of emerging within us. And, I think in many ways, what you did in this particular instance exemplifies sort of in my own reflection what feels like the right approach, at least for me, which is not merely to think on a programmatic level, but on a relational level. Like, not to feel like I've just got to do all, like I've got to donate and I've got to write to my senator or something, but to actually just look at the question of where in my life has a sort of systemic racism entered into the picture, so that I actually don't find myself in contexts whereby I would be interacting, making friends with, and so forth, say members of the African American community. How is there a kind of racism within the fact that those connections are sort of few and far between? And to try to ameliorate those, or to establish contexts where those connections can begin to more fluidly happen. You're going back to your church, calling your deacon friend is a perfect example of sort of making that connection happen, reinvigorating a relationship, and from that relationship grows appropriate responses within your own context. I think that that, in a sense, is, I have a parishioner here. In West Marin, it is a very white-dominated part of the world, with the exception of a Latino community, Latina, because of the ranches that we have out here that do a lot of the farming and so forth. And these are very much run by the Hispanic population. And I have a friend here in the parish who years ago realized, as she was walking down the main street of the little tiny little town we have nearby here, that all the people she was saying hi to were white, and that all these Hispanic people were just, in a sense, invisible to her. It wasn't because she had anything personal against them, but because she had never had an opportunity by which her world and their world would merge, and thereby forge the kinds of friendships that she had with all of these white people. And she began to realize there's a kind of systemic racism here, in which, as a white woman, I have no real points of social contact by which to naturally allow these relationships to emerge. So she has a little bit of means, and she ended up purchasing cameras and started a Latino photography project. And she donated these cameras to this little organization that she founded, and began working with members of the Latino community as a way of saying, basically, I want to see the world through your lens. What do you see? And got local photographers who were very skilled and artists to come together and to train and to teach these people. It has now grown into a huge organization out here. And of course, she is now always out on the ranches for every 16th birthday and every baptism and everything. And, you know, she's just been integrated into the family lives. And so finding a point of contact by which we can start to engage in real meaningful relationships, and asking what social systems are in place that simply make my world isolated from the world of a particular minority group. Ameliorate that piece of it, and just the natural inclinations of friendships begin to emerge. And I think we began to get a much better picture of, for example, a diversity of opinions within the African-American community about how this should be dealt with, right? When we stand from the outside, we tend to think like Black Lives Matter, everybody feels exactly the same way about that within the African community. That's simply not true. And immersing ourselves, we begin to realize, oh, these are people, not just a subset who thinks homogeneously about this issue. And then we begin to, I think, have our action become born of those intimate relationships. So I think your inclination was spot on, and I applaud you for that. So that's what we want to encourage, yeah. Paloma. Sorry, Paloma, you just want to go ahead and unmute there.
Is that working?
Yeah, that's better.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to respond to the first practice about grace and beauty, the beauty practice, if I might.
Sure.
I am participating today from San Diego, which is where my mother and father have lived. And my mother died last year, and so yesterday was her birthday. So we all gathered in her honor and in the presence of my dad to sort of support him and encourage him. And one of the ways I've been thinking about grace is in the aspects of synchronicity. Mm-hmm. Sort of when surprising things occur that I can, and I kind of assume from a evolutionary biology perspective that these things are always interconnected, and it's my blindness that doesn't allow me to see more of the interconnections more. But this was a surprising moment yesterday, and it ties into both grace and beauty, and I wanted to just share it briefly, which is we had like a little prayer circle in honor of my mom, and each one shared something that was their memory of her, what is her gift, her charism to us. And actually every single person said something about beauty. She was kind of a suppressed artist in a sense, with 6 kids, trying to sort of, expressed all that, and it did come through to us. But the symbol, her symbol was the butterfly. And as we were having this ceremony at lunchtime yesterday, praying, a butterfly came in to the middle of the, and there was a plant in the middle of the table outside, since we were kind of doing this sort of safe distance pod family gathering. And so we all started crying because we knew that that was her symbol and that she was there with us. So I just wanted to sort of share that. And then when we spoke about what her way had been with us, we were all saying sort of the beauty way was her way with us. So I just wanted to share her picture.
Ah.
And this little altar with her ashes.
Oh.
And especially since I'm never here in San Diego for this moment, I just wanted to have the synchronicity of this beauty way and of this being my mother, and ask your prayers.
Thank you for that. And of course. Yeah.
And if I can ask just one question, last night, all through the night, I kept hearing sounds in the house. My dad was fast asleep and hard of hearing, so he was not, up and moving. And I was here alone. And I just wanted to ask, is there any teachings or understandings that you have about this sort of presence of the departed? Because it was really quite shocking. I really thought he was up and wandering around, and I kept getting up through the night, trying to sort of see if he was okay. And he was asleep the whole time. But it was as though someone was opening cupboards and wandering around. And I just wondered if it was my mother, or what, or I don't know.
Yeah. So I tread delicately here, Paloma, because these experiences are so deep and personal. And the truth is, I don't have an answer other than to say that it has been my experience since my father's passing of having certain uncanny things unfold like that. And, I question in my own mind, is this a projection of wishful thinking, or is there something of the numinous in this? And the answer is it's mystery, and I don't know, but I can tell you that, even where perhaps it's a projection of the imagination, I always come back to Bernard Shaw's play on Joan of Arc, when he asks her, when she's at the Inquisition, and the Inquisitors say, well, Joan, are you sure that these visions and voices you hear aren't just your imagination? And she says, well, of course it's my imagination. How else would God speak to me but through my imagination? So it's such a beautiful way that she integrates and sort of, the question and the challenge. So I would say I know you to be a deeply sensitive woman, and that if there is a movement of the spirit of a loved one, it wouldn't surprise me if there was something in you that was able to to discern and depict that. So all I can say is hold on to that, and just know that regardless of what it is, it speaks to a deeper truth that your mother's very much with you in love.
Well, and thank you for allowing me to bring her present to our prayer circle this morning.
Yes, beautiful, of course. And Rowan, I think your hand was up. I'm not sure if it's down. I think it's been up and down a little bit a couple times. Was that an accident, or is there something you'd like to share?
If you broke up and you're referring to me, there were a few things. One thing, 40 years ago, I dated, or possibly sort of talking about dating, with an African-American woman. And we did not end up in a relationship, but I said one of my concerns was, in relating to her, was my racism. And she said to me, what makes you think Black people aren't racist? And I also had a conversation with a fabulous woman that I worked for a little bit, doing a little bit of bookkeeping for her and her husband. And the subject of racism and stereotypes came up. And she's from the Philippines. And she said, Filipinos are very prejudiced against Chinese people. And now that, of course, is a gross generalization, but I think that there's a tendency to think that we all don't have, that only Caucasian people have ideas about other people. And I also think it's important to know, in a sense, not to blame ourselves for stereotypes about things that about things, stereotypes about people that are passed to us, both historically from the media around us, and go, well, I didn't choose that. And there are some things that we all have a lot of stereotypes about people, how people dress a certain way, how people look, and because that can just alienate. I've been at churches that are, Episcopal churches that are quite large, maybe 250, 300 people on a Sunday. And when African American people show up, no one speaks to them. Now, these are all incredibly good and kind people. Are they going, well, we're not going to talk to those Africans? Of course not. But I think that there is something that has happened that has distanced people in the discussion to where it's like, well, I'm going to say the wrong thing, and I probably have some stereotypes and attitudes, and so and then it becomes, and then the whole situation becomes worse. As for myself, this week I had a huge thing happened where I was rather abruptly rejected for a retreat that I had been signed up for and was ostensibly very much welcome to in February. And it's like, well, we thought you weren't coming, so we took you off the list, and we had these other people. And that was really hard for me and changed a lot of things. And mostly what came up for me is that to seek God, which is what everyone, when one goes into a monastery and they ask you a question, they say, what do you seek? And I was told by my spiritual director, there's only one answer. And that answer is, I seek God. And I'm realizing that to seek God means I have to let go of attachments to people. Not necessarily letting go of relationships to people, but my attachments and my needs, and thinking about how I have been a problem for people tremendously in my life. Having had a really awful childhood. That's my phone, so I need to turn it. And that my personal damage is not someone else's responsibility, and to be more aware of that. Anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rowan. Maybe as a way of wrapping up in response to that today, what occurs to me is the image of small streamlets kind of running down a mountainside, each sort of with a trickle. But when we can gather those little streams, this disparate sort of streams, into one place, it can become a gushing, roaring river. And the work that I hear you talking about, and that I think in many ways serves to encapsulate the general trend of our conversation, is how do we examine those little streamlets and take those disintegrated parts of ourselves and intentionally sort of merge them, so that all of that energy that's getting dispersed and displaced in these various directions without much effect can become a powerful river of change within my own life, and then hopefully out into the world. So it's that that practice of merging those streamlets, and we have to identify what they are, where I've hurt people, where I've been prejudiced, where I have assumptions about other people, where I'm disintegrated, right, and so on. So the work of the Spirit is to merge those little wasted streamlets that have no real effect or power into one gushing river. And I think that becomes a powerful image for what it means to be deeply spiritual and in the world, but not of it, as it were, to your point about detachment. So so I leave you perhaps today with that idea and that image. So that brings us to about 8:45, and I know we're at about time. So I just want to, thank you all for hanging in this long and for sharing your perspectives, your stories, your insights, all of which are, as always, beautiful and give me great courage. So I hope to see you on Saturday next. I will be here. By the way, my sermon tomorrow, Dwight, is shaping up on the Jesus prayer. So I'll try to make that available as soon as possible, because it's something you might want to listen to. But by way of talking about the readings tomorrow really lend themselves to that. It's the story of Peter coming out on Jesus walking on water and Peter coming out to and then sinking and so forth. But so I'll if I think of it, Dwight, I'll make that available to you as well, especially because that's something you're grappling with now. So
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Okay, then I hope you'll have a lovely week. Benum Christ in it, and I look forward